What did you guys think? Did it make sense, the distinction, the polar opposite distinction between what we were talking about in regard to how the nations thought of their gods? How the nations thought of their gods versus how the Israelites thought of God, right? There are two fundamentally different ideas. One is that there are supernatural powers in the world, but they begin to exist. They're limited. They could die, right? And they're localized to a specific nation or a specific region. Whereas the biblical presentation of supernatural spirit is that ultimately there is one all powerful being that precedes all other existence, right? All other things that exist, they begin to exist. It's kind of it's sort of an intuitive way of thinking about yourself, about how you began to exist, right? And you know that your mother and father, they began to exist, and you know that your grandparents, they began to exist, and it just goes back and back and back and back, and you just think, well, if everything began to exist at one point, where does it end? And you know that it must end somewhere, right? And then you ask, well, what's beyond that? What what causes things? What? You have a comment?
So that's like it's like basically like a cycle. It's like
Mm-hmm.
when I always think of my grandma, I'm like, who's my grandma's mom? Who's my grandma's
Right.
mom? Who's my grand?
Yeah,
What?
exactly. And so that goes back to a point, and then it goes back to a point even beyond the existence of humanity, and then beyond the existence of the world, and then beyond the existence of the universe. At what point do we get to the very beginning and then say, well, what's before the beginning? And they thought about God in that way. They thought about the fact that we exist, and that must mean something, right? That must mean that we began to exist. And however we began to exist, however that worked, whatever's beyond that is ultimate power, right? So that was the conception. And that God is being, right? The idea that part of his, well, not part, that's not really the right word to use it, but an aspect of his nature, or the central aspect of his nature, is that he is the one who exists, right? I am that I am, right? So he doesn't depend on anything for existence. We depend on things. The world depends on things, right? It's like if we as a if our planet was like shifted over just like a few miles, right? It's like suddenly we've got issues, right? We're so dependent on the complexity of the universe being finely tuned, um, that like we can die in an instant, right? But God doesn't have that, right? God doesn't have these elements of reality that he depends on for his existence. He is reality. He is existence, you know? So when people say, in the, you know, in the Bible, when the Bible says that people have an encounter or run in with God, it's not saying that they're encountering some sort of entity or some sort of being that exists in the universe that is part of the world, right? It means that they are having a run in with ultimate reality itself. And sometimes people, I said this last time, that some people will use the term, well, the universe spoke to me. It's sort of like they're trying to get at that point, that like ultimate reality spoke to me or something like that. But still, they don't really understand, because the universe in their language is something that begins to exist, right? Welcome. Glad you can make it. Um, so yeah, so it's just a radically different way of thinking about the world. Ultimately, because it's a difference between, do we live with purpose and intention, or do we not, right? Do I come into being out of random chance or out of conflict between the deities, between the gods, or do I come into being out of intention and love and design, things like that? Does that make sense, guys? So just a little recap from last time. Um, if you guys want to go deeper into that topic again, just watch the recording. Does that make sense? Cool. Any other questions about that?
I can ask a question because I wasn't here your first time. And has this always existed in time and humanity? Because God created us so He knew that we were going to have a curiosity of trying to measure things,
Mm.
and time.
Mhm.
Like, we're in a culture where we have clocks and history books and the internet and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
But it's always been like that since, like, I don't know,
Not that long ago.
Adam and Eve's
Gotcha.
great grandkids. Like, we're great,
Yeah.
great. But, you
Mhm.
know, I wonder if they were, had the curiosity of, like, what before.
Yeah, there is a subtext in the Bible about different times in which humanity in general sort of abandons their memory or abandons their relationship with God, right? The first example of that would be Genesis chapter 4 or Genesis chapter 5. It will be a break between these individuals. There's a genealogy, and then there will be a verse that says, at that time they began to call on the name of the Lord, right? Of Yahweh. And so it's showing that there's a sort of time between not really like a forgetfulness on the part of, like, oh, I forgot, like my memory is now erased, but more so that they have neglected what their original state was, or what their original intention or design was, or God's intention or design for them was, right? And then another time would be like at the Tower of Babel. The idea is that there are a select few. Most people are sort of yoking themselves to these lesser deities, but there are a select few who have stayed true in faith of the one true God. So an example of that would be Abraham, right? Another example of that would be someone that Abraham encounters, like Melchizedek. So there are these figures that show up that it's like they are looking to what is highest and not these lower things. Does that make sense? So, and then as far as a curiosity is concerned, the Bible presents the beginning of humanity as being in communion with God, being in intimate communion with God, and then that communion breaking, right? So the idea is there is knowledge at the beginning, and then once that relationship breaks, there is a severance between that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Between that.
That makes a lot
Yeah.
of sense.
Gotcha. Cool. Any other questions? Today, we're actually cracking open the Bible. So did everyone bring their Bibles today?
No.
No? That's all right. I'll put the scriptures up on the screen as well, as we read. When we get into Genesis 1, that's what we're doing today, Genesis chapter 1. It is a part of the Bible that probably a lot of us are familiar with to a certain extent. But in other regards, we probably don't know that much about it. We just sort of know the general idea of it, but we haven't really taken the time. A lot of folk haven't really taken the time to dive very deeply into each individual word. And so we're going to try, maybe not every word, but we're going to try to really pull out the meaning of Genesis chapter 1 today. Any thoughts on Genesis chapter 1 from your guys' perspective before we hop in?
The question I always have is, was it a literal 7 days,
Right.
day, or not? To me, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's a good question, and we'll touch on it a little bit.
People really have their strong opinions
Yeah,
on that.
they get really intense about that
Yeah, they
question. And there's so many ways that you could take it. And there have been many ways that people have taken it throughout history. So, yeah, we'll get into that a little bit. When we talk about Genesis chapter 1, what are some of the elements that show up in Genesis chapter 1 that you guys can recall? Creation. So the narrative itself is a creation narrative. That's the whole point of the chapter, right? And we talked a little bit about creation narratives. What is a creation narrative?
The beginning.
It's a story about the beginning, right? It's a story about how and why the universe comes into existence, right? And do you guys remember when I showed you some non-biblical creation narrative stuff? Yeah. Go.
Like Luna and Roma.
Yeah, so not exactly. I don't know if you were here that week. I don't think you were, but it was 2 weeks ago. Yeah. Yeah, that's all right. So we talked about pagan creation accounts. Do you guys remember what the elements of those creation accounts, what was consistent between the pagan ones and the...
The untamed waters,
Okay.
and then there's like a battle between like the untamed waters and the two deities.
Yeah, so that was in the pagan version. The consistent
The untamed waters is the consistent in both versions.
yep, and the creation of heaven and earth, sky and land, right? That's going to be what is sort of consistent between the creation accounts. And so any other elements that are famous in Genesis 1 that you guys remember?
The Holy Spirit was floating over the water.
Okay, there we go. So we've got Trinitarian stuff in you've got the Word of God, you've got the Spirit of God, right? That show up in Genesis chapter 1. Patricia already brought up the days, right? The 7 consecutive days that show up in Genesis chapter 1.
Question on the concept of time, like our days versus his days.
Mm,
You know, that, I mean, that's really
it's an interesting question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So from what point of view does Genesis 1 take place is a good question, right? What's the POV, right? It's a good question.
I think the concept of rest. I think
Rest. Okay. Yeah, the 7th day of creation. Interestingly enough, you'll see as we get into it, that actually is in Genesis chapter 2. Yeah, yeah. No. It's fine. We're gonna do that. I don't know why there's a chapter break there because the poem has not finished. The entry poem has not finished. So we are jumping into chapter 2 today because we're gonna have to do that to get to the 7th day.
So touching on that, in our biblical verses, like the Hebrew Bible, like would that poem consist? Like
I see. Yeah, chapter and verse is not in the original. No, yeah, it's not in the original. Yeah. So that doesn't come until I believe like sometime after the Middle Ages. Yeah. So only, not 1,000 years ago, is when that started. So yeah. So
I always thought of God,
Mhm.
man,
Mm.
but he's really both
Mm,
man and woman. But then he creates.
I see what you're saying. The image of God.
Then he creates Eve, so I kind of associate that with Adam being Jesus and Eve being us,
Mm.
Christians.
Yeah. Well, you're getting at something.
So
Yeah. You are getting at something. Interestingly, do Adam and Eve show up in Genesis 1?
I thought they did.
therefore, because it tells you that he made like man and woman in his image, but then later in the chapter, he's like, man shouldn't be alone, and then
Yeah, so Genesis chapter 1 is different from Genesis chapter 2. Even as we bleed into, like I said, part of the first part of Genesis chapter 2, there's going to be a break in that storyline, and Genesis chapter 1 is itself altogether a separate piece from Genesis chapter 2, right? And most people will read it straight through as though it's talking about the same identical thing. It's not. Yeah, because when we go back to the assembly of the scriptures, our very first meeting about how we talked about the Bible has sources, it's pulling on different things. It's a mosaic. It's a quilt. It brings together all of this material. You can imagine at one time, Genesis chapter 1 was its own piece of material, right? Because of how it is separated from Genesis chapter 2. And so Genesis chapter 1, in the same way that the Psalms are separated, right? So you have Psalm 1, you have Psalm 2, you have Psalm 3. And that's not that sort of chapter and verse thing. That is consistent. There is such a thing as Psalm 110, if that makes sense. But so Genesis chapter 1, it is sort of its own segregated story. And in it, we don't find Adam and Eve, right? And we don't find some of the things that we associate with the creation of humanity. We don't find that in Genesis chapter 1. I'm not saying that we wholly should separate our thinking about them. We should keep them somewhat together because they are talking about similar things. And they're using similar language but they're different perspectives, right? They're sort of different angles on the story of the origins of the world and humanity and things like that. Does that make sense, guys?
Mhm.
Can I ask one question?
Yeah.
I just discovered this, and I don't know why or how. Maybe the doggone Instagram or something.
Uh-huh.
But it said something along the lines like everything is time. We always measure time as if it's an absolute. Somebody said something about um the book of Job being before Genesis.
Right.
And I've always thought, well, why is Genesis the first book of the Bible if Job was written? Or am I just
Um,
kind of falls?
it's a sort of it it's a myth. That's all I would say. Yeah, it's something that gets around, and you might hear that often. Um, there's no real evidence to say that Job takes place, or excuse me, that Job was written prior to Genesis. Simply because the reason people say that is because Job features figures that it seems like it's talking about the time of Abraham, for example. Um, but the language that is being used and the things that are referenced, it's referencing things that are only apparent in the time of the prophet, so way later, if that makes sense. Whereas Genesis, the Hebrew is a bit more archaic anyway, so even the writing itself is older in Genesis.
You've
Yeah.
seen that and you smell sulfur.
Well, I heard that a long time ago, but I've heard different opinions on it and stuff like that. And yeah, Job is very, very developed in how it presents things, whereas Genesis is very foundational, if that makes sense. There's an assumed knowledge of Job for the reader, if that makes sense, that Genesis is not presenting. So it's a good question. They say that because of how Job is presenting the figures in the story as being like older than the kingdom of Israel.
Right, I always looking for something.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, good question though. No, well, and here's the deal. Genesis is not the first written part of the Bible. It does show up at the beginning though. The first written part of the Bible is going to be the law itself, elements of the Torah during the time of Moses, right? About the things that are taking place there on Mount Sinai. That would be, and again, even like the things are happening in the Bible, spoken things that are happening in the Bible, they also take place prior. So when does the Bible originally written? Like the Song of Miriam after they passed the sea. Just a reminder of that first week. That's prior to its writing down, but it was still composed because Miriam is singing a song, right? That Israel sings. So and that's Bible, you know what I mean? But it's not written. So does that make sense? Anyway, it's a very interesting conversation that goes back to that first week. So we have also that recorded the first week, so you can go back and watch the making of the Bible one. Okay, you guys ready?
Yeah.
We are going to jump into Genesis chapter 1 today. I've got the NRSV on the left and the ESV on the right, so you can follow along on the screen. Okay. Now I will have folk read. Sorry, hang on one sec. Normally I will have other folk read and stuff, but just to start, I'm going to go ahead and read. And then in the future we'll sort of change it up if that's all right. You guys ready? Okay, so we're going to read through it and then we'll talk through it. Okay. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." So God made the dome, So God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome. And it was so. God called the dome sky. And there was evening and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed and fruit trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit with the seed in it. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed of every kind, and trees of every kind bearing fruit with seed in it. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate from the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. And let them be lights in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth." And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. God set them in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the dome of the sky." So God created the great sea monsters, and every living creature that moves, of every kind, with which the waters swarm, and every winged bird of every kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." Then there was evening and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind, cattle and creeping things and wild animals of the earth of every kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals of the earth of every kind, and the cattle of every kind, and everything that creeps on the ground of every kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." God said, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. Now turning to chapter 2. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their multitude. And on the seventh day, God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. Okay. Genesis chapter 1 and verses 1 through 4 of chapter 2. All right. How are we feeling? Good? Immediate thoughts, immediate reflections, things that are popping out, things that you might have underlined or circled, or notes in your margins.
I got one of those off the wall.
Okay.
Okay, so this was God's plan from the very beginning of existence.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that the rock, earth, was in darkness. So he created heaven and he created earth. But he casted out an angel onto earth. And I just barely understood this right now, that God was still here on earth. Well, God's everywhere.
Mhm.
But he sent old hairy legs here.
Okay. Are you talking about Satan?
Yeah.
Okay.
Before he created even light. So there was a plan from the very beginning.
Well, it is interesting. The question of when did this satanic figure, when was his fall, right? Was it prior? Some people will say, is it prior to what we just read, or is it after when we just read, right? What do we say to that?
It doesn't say.
It hasn't said yet. We haven't had at least a fall of Satan or a fall of this angelic figure hasn't appeared in the scripture yet. But we are just in the first chapter of the first book, first page 1. But yeah, are there times in the Bible where it does say when that happens?
Yes.
And when does it happen?
I think it's in, was it Ezekiel?
There is a passage in Ezekiel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the only one I think.
In the Ezekiel passage, it talks about him being this figure in the Garden of Eden, that the fall happens in the garden itself. So we haven't had a fall yet, if that makes sense. Yeah. You are correct in saying that God creates with the knowledge of rebellion, right? God values the life enough that says, even though I have a foreknowledge of these beings rebelling against me, it's worth it that they would exist. So you are on the right track there. It's just that Satan has not chronologically fallen in the text yet. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Any other thoughts or things that jumped out at you right away as we were talking?
Okay, weird, and this is my sciencey brain going, and this thinking about this its whole home and stuff.
Mhm.
When he starts talking about the lights in the expanse of the sky, I mean, we now know if we're talking about sky as in the sky of the earth, we know the sun is not in our sky.
Yeah.
Right. And so those types of things, when you're reading it, go, this is why to me it's a very poetic thing.
Yeah.
Because we know the sun and the moon aren't within our Earth's sky.
Right.
But they show up in our sky.
Exactly.
And so that's the kind of stuff that I don't know how literal we take this, because the sun cannot exist inside of our sky. But I get visually where they're coming from, that we see the sun in our sky.
Yeah.
Governs the things. I totally get the whole, this is going to mark your seasons or whatever.
Right.
But to take it literally saying the sun is in our sky, that just jumped out just now.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. We just talked about what the sky is between the waters.
Absolutely.
Now it's going to put the lights in the sky. I'm like, okay, well, we know that the sun is not in the sky, but we see it.
Yeah.
As looking at it. So,
Yeah.
And the poeticness and the whole, what's literal, what's not. It's a very fluid,
Yeah. It's something to wrestle with. Yeah, that's for sure.
I were on a walk last night. We were looking at the moon, and we were like, I wonder how far away ancient people thought the moon was, how big it was.
Thinking about it from their perspective and their time.
Yeah.
I get that.
Yeah, if you think back to our cosmology meeting, we talked a little bit about that. Something to think about is the dome of the sky. What it represents is not our atmosphere, right? It represents everything that is above your head that is still in creation. You see what I'm saying? So the dome separating the waters, they represent a nothingness or a sort of raw, barren, no order, right? And so if you do want to question Genesis in light of science and cosmology, it's a matter of, yes, sun, moon, and stars, they're inside the dome. We just, like in our modern cosmology, the dome is the edge of the universe, right? Yeah. Yeah. So it wouldn't be our atmosphere. You would be talking about in regards to sky and space, that would be heavens, right? Heavens above. Remember, heaven and earth, and we'll get into this. I have slides for this, but heaven and earth, it's referring to above your head and below your head, right? So the things that are above you and below you is essentially, in the beginning, it's a perfectly accurate translation for Genesis 1:1 to say, in the beginning, God created the sky and the land. You see what I'm saying? The idea, but it's like, oh, what about heavens? You know what I mean? It's Shamayim is the Hebrew term, and it's sky, land, and it has to do with that directionality. Okay.
Kind of leads into something that jumps out to me is like, when he's describing everything, it's like one into the next. So like light and dark, which then encompasses to me everything in between. So like the sun, or like the land and the water encompasses everything, like land animals and like just like how he describes things like on from one spectrum to
Yeah.
the next, and how God can kind of does everything in between. Like instead of naming all of the little things,
All the intricacies. I see what you're saying. Yeah. There. Okay, so is that something that you guys noticed? There are certain particular divisions, and they're numerically interesting. So lots of divisions into two, right? Sky and land, waters and land, light and darkness. You see what I'm saying? The division of animals into three: beasts, wild animals, creeping things. So that's very interesting about certain divisions. And these divisions are relevant according to our experience. So even the idea of there are animals that you tame, there are animals that eat you, right? And then there are things like that crawl up out of the ground, and you know what I mean, things that you don't really want to be interested in. They live under the rocks and things like that. There are different experiences of animals. It's describing it's putting them into these categories of experience. So that's very interesting. Let's get into the slides, if that's all right, and we can continue talking through all of this, if that's okay. So if you guys remember Genesis 1 to 11, it's different than Genesis 12 through 50. In its genre, we're talking about a prologue. Think of Lord of the Rings. You know how in Lord of the Rings, there's like the first 5 minutes, it's its own thing, right? It's its own little narrative, but it's setting up what's to come with Frodo and Gandalf and things like that. This is sort of what Genesis 1 to 11 is. It's this epic prologue where you can just read it in Galadriel's voice and from the Lord of the Rings. And anyway, I'm gonna skipping forward a little bit. So the big point, or the main idea, one of the main ideas at least of Genesis 1, is that meaning is prior to matter. Okay? Meaning, so yeah, that's something to write down. Meaning is prior to matter. There is a debate between philosophers and cosmologists that ask the question, does soul or spirit or consciousness or anything like that, does it emanate? It's the difference between eminence or emergence, okay? The fancy words, but the idea here is, does consciousness rise from non-consciousness, or does consciousness give birth to material? You see what I'm saying? So we're all conscious beings, and the question is, when does that happen, or where does consciousness come from? Does it come from us evolving to a point where consciousness emerges, where it develops to a point where, aha, we've reached sort of this event horizon, and now we have consciousness, right? Or is consciousness primary, right? Does consciousness pre-exist matter, right? Physical things. And what's important about that is physical things have a conscious element to them, in that the laws of nature, they're a sort of language. Okay. So if you know anything about how the universe works, it runs on physics, right? And physics is a sort of language, right? That there's mathematics that are holding the table together, right? That are holding my cells together. Same thing, speaking of cells, same thing with biology, that my DNA is a sort of language, right? It's a language of 4 letters, sort of like binary code. Binary is just 2, but it's a language of 4 letters, metaphorically speaking, that one after the other create a code that makes up my being. And so the problem with this sort of question of consciousness and where does consciousness emerge, or is it prior to matter, is that we find that conscious language, only conscious beings use language, and language is what makes up the universe. Does that make sense? The laws of nature, they run off of a kind of language, okay? And so what you have in the Bible is that presentation that language is prior. You see what I'm saying? That God speaks. It's a word-based existence, right? That God speaks, and he doesn't just speak arbitrarily. He speaks and gives names to things, okay? So it's that he calls something what it is, and then it begins to exist. You see what I'm saying? And then he evaluates it. That's sort of the pattern of the Genesis 1. And did you guys capture that pattern there? He says what a thing is, it begins to exist, and then he evaluates it, right? and he evaluates it, of course, as good.
Does it
So
also come from the dirt, from the land?
things do emerge, right?
Yeah.
So that's a good question. Things emerge out of the chaos waters, they emerge out of the land. Things do come up out of the ground, but they come up out of the ground as a response to the spirit or consciousness emanating from above. These are, again, complex terms, but the word comes down from above, it lands on the ground, and then what comes up is what was spoken, right? That's sort of the pattern that we see.
That's Jesus' pattern, right?
Explain.
He says we're going to the other side of the lake.
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. Yeah. So the command of God is what happens. Yeah. The point here is that God, in speaking, he's giving meaning to things, and then that is what makes them exist, right? And so some folk will be it'll be interesting that they will describe that you actually have somewhat of a similar experience, that once you start this is our image of God in us. Once you start giving names to things, that's when they suddenly pop into existence. Okay. Otherwise, because you hadn't known what a thing was before, to you it was non-existent, right? It didn't have meaning, therefore it wasn't relevant to your cognition, and you didn't even recognize it as a thing. Does that make sense?
When Jesus speaks, like there's a form of intelligence as he's giving these commands.
Yeah, you mean in Genesis? Yeah, right,
There's
right.
a form of intelligence, and we talked about meaning,
Hmm.
and then there's a purpose behind it all.
Yeah, so purpose is the other thing. The things that he um, he develops these things, or he creates these things in relationship to other things.
Right.
Right. And so the idea is that the things that he's making, they have a relationship to the things that are created prior to them, or they have a functional operative purpose, that they are to work in tandem with the rest of reality. Right. And so, again, that's things don't exist arbitrarily. They exist in harmony with each other. These are the sorts of things that are being described in Genesis 1, that meaning is prior to material. Okay. And again, that's going to be the opposite of sort of a contemporary materialist or atheistic worldview that says that matter, they would acknowledge that consciousness exists, but then they would say consciousness somehow arrived or arose at some point, and it emerges. It's an emergent property, as they would say, whereas the Bible is presenting consciousness as the primary property, God's consciousness. You see what I'm saying? Everyone follow me there?
Teacher? Yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying this just gives even more power behind when God says you don't get to name me.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he's the one who names things, and he's the one who defines his own being, right? So the text itself, Genesis chapter 1, starts with who we talked about last week, right? The being of God, one who is, or I am that I am, a pre-existent nature of consciousness, that, again, you can't even say predates the universe, because prior to the universe there is no space-time, right? So the idea of chronology, it's what we would call eternity, right? This state of being that is by nature not bound by time, right? It's the property of existence in general that is God. You see what I'm saying? Or the element of existence. Again, these are not even the right terms necessarily to be using. It confounds our language. But the idea is we came into being at a certain point, and being coming out of non-being, you need being to do that. Does that make sense? That's probably the best way that I could talk about why the Bible says that God is self-evident. Being cannot come out of non-being without being. The universe has being, but it began to exist. So it began to exist by the will or the action of being. Okay? God. Does that make sense, guys? You following? Sort of, yeah. So in the beginning, the Hebrew word for in the beginning is Bereshit. Okay? Now, the first verse of the Bible is actually a dependent clause. Does anyone know what that means? A dependent clause? Yeah. Do you want to explain it?
A dependent clause depends on the independent clause of the sentence.
Okay.
I don't know.
Yeah.
The meaning is dependent on
What comes next?
Yeah.
Yes, what comes next? So oftentimes it's translated, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, full stop, right? Actually, the way that Bereshit is being presented, this is why in the translation that I read, it says, in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth. It's perfectly fine to translate it, when God began to create the heavens and the earth, comma, the earth was formless and void, right? You see what I'm saying? So the idea is it's talking about what the first verse is it's talking about the state of conditions at the beginning. You see what I'm saying? So it's not really a statement in and of itself, full stop. It is talking about how things are when God arrives to the unordered creation to order it. Okay? Does that make sense? So when God began would be the most literal translation, making it depend on the inclusion of a subject. When God began, as well as the following predicate, to create. When God began to create. The Hebrew word for create is bara. Bara. Okay? What do you think of when you think of creation or create? The act of creating. Building. Okay. Building out of what? Huh? Wood. Yeah. Things that exist you use to develop, right? We can't create out of thin air, right? We can't just generate spontaneously things to exist, right? What the Bible presents is God, again, as I said, brings being, existence out of non-existence, right? So this is what in, I think it's a Latin term, people will call creation ex nihilo. That means creation out of non-creation, meaning things don't exist prior to the creation. It's the same or similar sort of thing as life coming out of death, right? In the resurrection, that the idea is that there's no opportunity in a natural order of things or the way that things are going for this to happen, but it's happening, right?
I
And
think
so
like verse 9 and 10, right? Because that's like the original formation.
which verses?
9 and 10, the water in the skies.
I see what you're saying. Mhm. Yeah, but God is creating. There is something that God is dealing with. It seems to be at least presenting that way, and those things are the waters, right? The waters, what do they represent? They represent potential and chaos and disorder and sort of this thing that is just sort of, there's nothing really to it, right? Nothingness or disorder. So the Hebrew word bara is about more than what I just said, though. It's about more than just coming into existence. To bara something is to organize it, to give it order and design. When you clean your room, you bara your belongings into their proper place. When you cook a meal, you bara ingredients with intention and design. Bara is a term meaning the formation and organizations of things in the world with regard to design and purpose. Okay? So think about a tornado that went through a house, right? Chaos waters. Okay? The idea of things are disordered, they're all over the place, right? And you can't function, you can't operate in a setting like that. So what we know to do instinctively is to begin to bara things. We begin to organize them. We begin to put them into their proper place so that that household can start functioning again. Are you following me? That's sort of the nuance of the word bara. God is, at the same time that you could say he is bringing existence out of non-existence, it's not just leaving it at that. It's not that the things begin to exist. It's that he's putting things in their proper place. That's part of giving names to things, right? That he's saying, this is light and this is dark, and they have a play between them. This is sun, moon, and stars, and they have a reason for existence. He's putting things where they belong. You see what I'm saying?
Does it also mean he uses his emotions to do it? Because when I create, I do artwork, and when I create, it's like I'm thinking about what I want. I want to do it this way. It's not just
Absolutely.
done it.
Yeah, absolutely. Remember that we talked about how God is a personal being. We talked about this last time. And so we shouldn't be talking about, when we're thinking about this, we're not talking about sort of an impersonal presence. We are talking about later biblical verses in scriptures will talk about God's joy in creation, the delight that he has in creating things, and that I am myself fearfully and wonderfully made, knitted me together in my mother's womb. The idea is that, yeah, as God is creatively barawing things, he's doing things with intention and purpose and design and taking joy in, that's his proclamation that it is good, right? You see what I'm saying?
That's what I was gonna
Yeah,
ask you.
yeah.
Like it's one thing to say that and that and that, but it would seem like there was a pause where that is good.
Yeah. So he's pleased when he baraws something into its proper place. It brings him pleasure.
Is good in Hebrew or whatever language it is?
There are nuances to that. We're going to get to that. So bara is an example of bara being used at another time in the Bible is like this. And Joshua said to them, if you are a numerous people, go up by yourselves to the forest there and bara the ground. So are they bringing the ground into existence? No, they're not bringing the ground into existence. They are making room for themselves. They're making a space for themselves so that they can live and operate in a way that is ordered. Okay? So, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim. Hashamayim is the skies and the heavens. Okay, so we talked about this as a recap, but the Hebrew term for heavens is simply the Hebrew term for all the space that is above your head, and the realm of existence beyond the land. The heavens or skies are plural because of the multiple layers that one has to pass through as they ascend the skies towards God, right? Ascend up in the heavens, the realm of where the birds live, where the clouds are, where the sun, moon, and stars are, the dome, beyond the dome, the throne room. Does that make sense? So Shemaim and Eretz, it's all of the land beneath your feet. Okay. So when we talked about that, we've already kind of gone over this, so I'm not going to continue going over it. But so when God began to create the heavens, the sky, and the land, everything above your head and everything below your feet, when God began to create, the earth was a formless void. What does your translation say? Mine says a formless void.
A desolate emptiness.
A desolate emptiness. What else? Formless and empty. Okay. So the Hebrew, it's actually a rhyme. Tohu va vohu. Okay. Tohu va vohu. And this is the description of those chaos waters. Formless and empty. We've already covered this a lot, right? And so this is why in those weeks we were sort of teeing up what we're going over now so that you guys aren't like, what is it talking about? So the description of the pre-creation chaos waters, this important phrase frames for the biblical story the state of existence before and without the creative productivity of the creator, right? What's interesting about this is this sort of term is not the first time or the only time that this term will appear in the text. When the prophet Jeremiah is describing the state of things after Israel has failed royally and been exiled, or when they're being exiled, he is using this descriptive language to talk about decreation, that the world is now going back into the formless and emptiness. He says, look, I looked upon the earth and it was tohu vavohu. You see what I'm saying? He will use those words. And he said the sun gave no light, things like that. It's a reverse of Genesis 1. We have a reverse creation narrative in that prophet. And it will have that same sort of. So the idea is God is taking the chaos waters, which are formless and empty, and he's giving them meaning, design, purpose. And then humanity is going to do its best, unfortunately, to reverse that, right? Is going to do its best to undo what God has done. Okay. Darkness was darkness covered the face of the Tehom. Darkness covered the face of the Tehom, a specific term referring to the endless abyss of chaos, right? So when we talk about sin in the Bible has a link to these sorts of words, okay? What sin in the Bible represents is actions that bring us closer to this than further away from it. Does that make sense? God creates out of the deep abyss. He creates out of non-life. He creates out of disorder. Sin and sinful actions. And again, in Genesis chapter 3 and 4 in particular, the story of the fall, the story of Cain and Abel, this will start to be more apparent. The idea here is that the actions that we take in life, they take what God has purposed and they disorder them. You see what I'm saying? So the state of non-being, non-productivity, non-life, discordance, disorder, and darkness. Okay. So this is the state of things prior to creation. Disorder, darkness, nothingness, death. Think about, just think about this sort of state of utter, you could do nothing about it, right? Because what comes next is the most important thing. The Spirit of God was hovering over that state of disorder, And when the Spirit of God comes over the waters, it's not just disorder anymore. It becomes potential. You see what I'm saying? So what is to everything that is not God, what is the state of chaos is just the most powerful thing in the world, right? I'm not being very philosophically descriptive. I guess the point, I'm not like trying to be systematic about it. I'm just trying to give you an idea of the only thing that can overcome a state of chaos that is being described, these chaos waters, it would be the Spirit of God. Okay? So the Spirit of God is hovering over the waters. My translation here said the wind of God. The wind of God. That's because the Hebrew word ruach means wind and breath and spirit, right? So you could say the breath of God was hovering over the waters, or the wind of God, or the Spirit of God. Those things are sort of connected in the Hebrew mindset.
Yeah, the disorder, I'm trying to understand the disorder of the water. Like, they're a little bit wild and a little bit...
The water represents that there is no intention, there is no purpose, there is nothing. Think about water it's a symbolic term. If you want to take things in our modern sense, think about like the idea of the Big Bang, right? And about how like the state of being right after the Big Bang, how there's nothing, it's just all matter, right? Just sort of going out into existence, right? And there's nothing to it. There's no life necessarily. It's just all raw material. You see what I'm saying? So the waters, they represent that state of it being sort of a soup of nothing, right?
Right. Well, I remember last year, I couldn't wait to get to where you were going to go back to Genesis.
Nice.
You always talk about everything goes back to Genesis. 1, 2, 3.
It's
1,
true.
2, 3.
It's
So I've been looking at my chop for a while to get
okay. All right.
So I also discovered like a month ago that Jesus calmed the storm, which was water.
Yeah.
And these disciples, they watched miracle after miracle after miracle after miracle.
Mhm.
And they were just like, But when he calmed the waters,
Yeah.
they were amazed.
Right.
And I just thought, kind of parallel. Is
Yeah.
this kind of like the parallel you're talking about? Like everything goes back to 1, 2, and 3?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So you're on the right track in that what Jesus is doing, what's so amazing about him making a deaf person hear, right? It is bringing back to order what is disordered. You see what I'm saying? So the calming of the walking on the waters, it's the same parallel to him making a mute person speak, right? The idea is that there's formless potential, a disordered nature, right? That he's bringing back into its purpose, right? That he's restorative in that process, that they have issues, right? The blind see, right? It's sight coming out of a non-functional thing, right? And so every time Jesus is doing these things, it's what we're describing in the creative act of Genesis, right?
This one wasn't walking on the water.
You're talking about calming the storm.
Yeah. And this one was, these guys were saying, we are going to die.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. There are two different instances where that happens. And yeah, the calming of the storm, it is tapping into the same sort of imagery. Yeah. So yeah, that's great.
In Genesis, it's like even even this person has the power that even the land and earth, acknowledge him, like obey him.
Yeah, it's the same sort of creative act. He speaks and then things happen. So the Hebrew word for spirit, which is also the word for wind and breath, referring to the animating energy of creation that makes inanimate things live and or move, right? This is not to be confused with sort of a law or force, like the law of gravity, for example, the force of gravity. The spirit is, you okay? No. It gets stuck. It's the left one. Yeah, you got to hit it hard. There you go. So the spirit, don't confuse the spirit with a law or a force. Okay. It's not sort of a thing that the point is that it's not a thing that sort of exists on its own and just the spirit is the thing that moves other things and makes other things go. You see what I'm saying? The spirit or the ruach is rechef, over the waters. The spirit of God is described as hovering over the watery abyss. This word is elsewhere used to illustrate a mother bird fluttering over her young, her wings outstretched over them. The hovering term found here presents God's spirit as that which comes down to feed the nest or the womb of potential. Okay? So the spirit of God, can you think of another time in which the spirit is used, has a bird language? The dove, right? Descending on Jesus. Oh man, whoa, does it all go back to Genesis 1? What is Jesus doing? It says as he was coming up out of the waters, the Spirit of God came down in the form of a dove and alighted on him, right? Or I got chills as we talk about it. You see what I'm saying? How cool that is, right?
Every form of the Godhead has some sort of participant in making.
Yes, absolutely. They're all participating. Yeah. Pretty awesome, right, guys? Okay. So, and also this sort of feminine, loving, motherly language that God is coming to feed the potential. You see what I'm saying? That this is a nest or a womb, right? That God is going to bring creation up out of, right? So he is ordering an unordered cosmos. Now, we've already talked a little bit about the Trinitarian language that is already imbued. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," right? And Jesus is that word of God, right? That now he is going to, when God speaks, remember, everything is made through him, per the New Testament, what the New Testament says. So everything is made through the word of God. In the beginning was the word, and the word was God. The word was with God. Does that make sense? So the words that God speaks are the things that create, right? And Jesus is the creator. He is that word. Okay. So we have that Trinitarian language. Do you have something to say? Okay, cool. Yeah. So you have, as you said, the participation. You won't find at any point in the Bible where like the Spirit is just necessarily like standing back. You see what I'm saying? Or the Son is necessarily just like, oh, he's doing that, they all participate in the action of God, right? So day one, God calls light out of darkness. And remember what we talked about. This is all connecting to what we're talking about, what Jesus is doing in the Gospels, how he's bringing sight to the blind, speech to the mute, hearing to the deaf, and raising from the dead people and himself. This idea of chaos, disorder, discordance, decomposition, he is reversing that action. Right now, we're talking about the original version of that, where he is bringing life out of non-life, existence out of non-existence, light out of darkness. If this room is dark, it's not like we could just generate light. You see what I'm saying? The idea is that God is the only one who can do that, who can create spontaneously, because he, as the Bible says, we talked about this last week, he is light, he is being, he is love. You see what I'm saying? He is truth. And so he is able to, from himself, emanate those things. Okay?
The center of a black hole.
The center of a black hole is a good way of thinking about the abyss, or right, this tehom, concept, the center of a black hole, right? Where
Mhm.
scientists will tell you, like, there's nothing you can do to climb out of that hole. You know what I mean? It will suck you in for eternity, right?
There's really maybe a whole bunch of stuff in there.
Right, yeah. That's another interesting question. Yeah. Okay, I'm beyond my knowledge. Um, yeah, but there's no light. Yeah, not even light photons can escape a black hole. So, yeah, interstellar. That's so funny. So, and he saw what does he say at the end of his creative acts?
It's good.
It was good. So tov. So this is on theme with everything that we're talking about. The word tov doesn't just mean moral good. It means productivity. It means harmony, right? Tov is the word assigned to things that operate appropriately according to their intentional design, purpose, and meaning. For something to be tov is the opposite of formless and empty. Think of them as polar opposite extremes, okay? Tohu vabohu, or vohu, and then tov. Those are different. They're like the opposite ends of that spectrum. For something to be good it means it operates correctly, functionally, according to its design and purpose. Okay. Does that make sense, guys? This is going to be again important when we get into Genesis chapter 3, and we're talking about the tree of the knowledge of Tov and Ra, right? The idea of, and it will help enlighten. I'll just give it to you just briefly, a little sample. You should already be starting to be enlightened to the idea of what Tov and Ra there are. That God in his creative act is deciding between things, right? He's ordering things. He's putting things in their proper place. And so when the humans, they eat outside of the command of God, they eat of the tree of the knowledge of Tov and Ra, they have now decided that they will define reality for themselves, right? That they break relationship with the order of creation and they now try to be like God, right? So we'll get into that. And the day language, okay? So we got into this. So there was evening and there was morning, the first yom, which can mean day, week, month, year, or age, okay? So yom is a general term referring to any sort of division of time. It may be referring to a single day-night cycle. Yom also may refer to any given measure of time containing multiple day-night cycles. Sometimes it may refer to a whole age or extended time period. Okay, so this sort of gets into your question, Patricia, at the beginning about literal 24-hour days or not. We'll just touch on that briefly at the very end. Okay. And then so light is what's created on day 1. On day 2, the rakia is created. Do you guys remember what we talked about in regard to the rakia? We've talked a lot about this already, the dome, right? This is a element of creation that we're unfamiliar with, but it's an assumption for modern people, is the rakia is considered to be a construct of a clear glass-like dome dividing the realm of created order from disorder, right? So the division is a thing that divides, that basically says this is the universe, this is creation, and this is non-creation. You see what I'm saying? So in our modern cosmology, again, that would be something like the universe, the edge of the universe, right? Yeah. So which actually the universe in modern cosmology is constantly expanding. You know what I mean? So there's something to that that's very interesting. But so this is going to be important. Understanding the rakia and the conception of the rakia is going to be important, especially as we get into things like Ezekiel or Revelation or things like that. Because when you have prophets having visions of the throne room of God in the heaven of heavens, they will describe it as being above the dome. Okay, does that make sense? So day 1 is light and day 2 is the dome. And it represents the livable realm, right? The realm where things exist and live that are not God, right? He brings the land up out of the waters, right? and he brings food up out of the land. Okay? Seed-bearing plants, right, is the idea, and plants bearing fruit. So that's days 1 through 3. So what do we have created in days 1 through 3? A foundation, an arena, you could say, a place where things happen. Hey Ryan, would you be able to help? Oh, she got it. Cool. Cool. So let's jump to day 4 now. You guys ready? And just stop me if we're going too fast. Jumping to day 4 now. It says, "And God said, let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from night. Let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years, and let them be lights in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth." And it was so. God made the 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And he set them in the dome of the sky to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate light from darkness.
So that's when he made the first 24-hour period.
Conceivably, yes. You could say that, yeah, because we measure the 24 hours based off of those lights in the sky. Is that, yeah. Yeah, that's a really interesting question or point that you're making. But anything noticeable in that little passage there? What does he make the lights in the sky? What are they for? Signs. What does it mean for things in the sky to be signs?
Like the seasons. Well, I mean,
Do you need the signs in the sky to determine
well, that's not
the seasons?
to the wise men and the birth of Jesus. Like they looked at the cosmetologies, certain star patterns in the sky, where there's signs of the future.
The astronomical constellations.
Correct.
Were you there for that teaching
I believe so.
on the men's? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, you taught that one.
Yeah, I did. Yeah. Signs in the sky. Yeah. Do we need stars to determine the seasons?
Yes.
We do, yes, in a sense of determining time, but are there other things that tell us what season it is? Yes, yeah. Right? So the leaves change and the weather changes, and right. So there's something important about these signs in the sky that's more than just the functional aspect of the leaves turn brown and the crops, certain crops come at different times and things like that, right? The signs. So the Hebrew term is moed, right? In our modern conception, seasons only have to do with the life and death cycle of spring, summer, fall, and winter. However, in the biblical conception, seasons have more to do with the calendar schedule for sacred festival worship. Okay? So signs for seasons, it's not their sacred festivals are going to have to do with the rotation of the crops. That's true. But the primary thing here is the worship calendar. You see what I'm saying? The primary thing here is keeping time so that we know when to worship what, right? Or not who to worship, not we know who to worship, but on what topic are we worshiping? You see what I'm saying? The ancient ceremonial holidays were as follows: Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, Pentecost, trumpets, atonement, and tabernacles. 7 core festivals that take place during the timeline of Israel history, year by year. Okay? So this is the Israelite calendar, right? In bringing up the topic of sacred time in Genesis chapter 1, the author is already looking ahead into the story of the Bible when signs in the sky will point toward special events that are to take place on the land, right? So the idea here is that order and commands, they come from above. They come through these intermediary beings that are giving Israel the sign that says, this is the time for this. You see what I'm saying? I said intermediary beings. We'll get more into that. But the heavens declare the glory of God, per Psalm 19. As we talked about, the Star of Bethlehem, right? These elements of things happen in the sky, and that's significant to what is going to happen, right? And this idea of a timeline that is reaching a climax, okay?
So God created every single insect on the planet at this point. Meaning,
No one can know.
well, I mean, like we know that there's saber-tooth tigers because of the bones and dinosaurs and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But you know, the schools and all that, they teach this evolution kind of weird stuff. What I'm saying is there was a purpose behind all of it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we won't necessarily get into the evolution discussion today, just because that's really complex.
Well, we can say that he created.
We can say everything was created. Yeah. And we could say everything was created intentionally with design and purpose. And yes, certain animals have gone extinct, that have come into being. That is true. So, so God creates. So sorry, what'd you say?
Why do we have?
Mosquitoes. That's a great question. Oh man, there's so many things that could be said. I can't say them though because of time. Let's continue on track with Genesis 1. Okay. We'll talk about mosquitoes in Genesis 3. How about that? Okay, something else that he creates. On day 5, he creates. This is verse 20. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let the birds fly above across the dome of the sky." So God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves of every kind. Does that your translation say sea monsters? Sea creatures. Mine is the only one that says sea monsters. Okay. God created the Tanin. The Tanin. So this is another aspect of creation that we are unfamiliar with. Okay. The Tanin was taken for granted in the mind of an ancient Israelite. In Genesis, God brings life and purpose to dwell even in the realm of chaos and disorder. So there are seas, right? The seas continue to exist. And God puts life even in the seas and gives the seas purpose. Okay. So already the idea of the primordial chaos waters is now different necessarily from the sorry, Kaylin. um, the primordial state of the chaos waters is a little bit different from the seas that now have swarms of living creatures in them, right? But the Tanin, it translates to Leviathan in the Bible. Your translators are not translating it Leviathan here, but Leviathan is where you will find the word Tanin in other places of the Bible. Okay. So the Tanin. And we'll get into more of what these beings and these sorts of creatures are. I'm just going over the days. So he creates the sea monsters and sea creatures on day 5. And then on day 6, he creates humanity and land animals. Okay. And then I just put the heavenly throne room there as well because, it doesn't really describe him constructing in Genesis 1 a throne room. But the idea here is that God takes up residence in a heavenly temple outside of the creation. Right. So there's an element of creation or an element of existence, an aspect that is not present. But this is how things are at the end of the creation of Genesis. What is not present here?
You didn't talk about hairy legs yet.
There you go. Hairy legs.
Hairy legs, that's
What is hairy legs associated with? Spider? Sorry, he's talking. Yeah. Yes, he's talking about Satan, right? Yeah. Okay. What was not originally intended is not present. Okay. So evil, the experience of evil, the experience of disorder, God creates an ordered realm. What is not present is what evil leads to, which is what? Sin, death, and what? Okay. No. Hell. Hell. Anyone see hell here?
Well, isn't it supposed to be like where the sea monsters like underneath the ocean?
Yeah.
The waters.
Yeah. So, yes. It's just you might have heard at some point or another, God created hell. it's a misunderstanding of what is going on, because hell does not appear in Genesis 1. You see what I'm saying?
Term Leviathan, right? Isn't that like a reference?
We'll get into it. Yes. Well, okay, go ahead.
That's what I was saying.
Okay.
If you say if it's translated sea monster,
Yeah.
that doesn't sound not evil.
Yeah, that's a great point. It doesn't sound
You said there's no evil.
yeah.
That seems evil.
It's not evil.
A monster.
Yeah. Evil is disorder in the mind of the Hebrew writer, right? So evil is when Leviathan gets up on the land.
When things are in their place, it's good. Even all these beasts,
There you go.
he gave them all plants to eat. Not no one's carnivorous.
Absolutely.
So it's like this is like the perfect. Not even say perfect, but this is the good way it's supposed to be. Yes,
Yeah.
there's huge creatures to fill a huge ocean, but they're not coming to eat you.
Yeah,
So they're
that's a great point. Yeah, you got it. You got it.
Really understanding how the Hebrew person is writing this, like for other Hebrews to understand.
Yeah, Leviathan, a good way of thinking of Leviathan is like a lion. Lions are dangerous, right? But they exist and they're good, right? And they're awesome. Does that make sense? So that's a way of thinking about it. A lion to us, a hungry lion is a monster, right?
Yeah.
But again, and so this will also get into the Garden of Eden question, because the Garden of Eden in particular is where things are operating completely so optimally that is an image of the perfect. The idea of all of the animals are coming under the control and dominion of the human, right? So yeah, that's a really good question. Hell and Sheol. Sheol is the realm of the dead. It's the underworld, right? And so hell is what happens, or Sheol is what happens when Leviathan and humanity mix, right? When the order that God has formed turns into disorder, right? It turns into not how it should be. So I think we were tracking, and I think you helped us along with that as well. Your guys' question and conversation. Okay, does that make sense? So we'll continue talking about that as well. So these are the days 1 through 7, right? Light and darkness, dome and waters, land and seed, sun, moon, and stars, winged and sea creatures, land creatures, and humanity. Okay, you can see that those divisions there. Actually, it's mostly 2 for everything: light and darkness, dome and waters, land and seed, sun and moon, greater light, lesser light, and then it also has the stars. So in addition, the winged and sea creatures, the land creatures, so animals and humanity, and then the fullness, right? Anyone notice a pattern here? Yeah, they're all in 2s. A major division here, or a break would, sorry, go ahead. No?
I was gonna say pattern, but
Oh, that's all right. I was just going to say, days 1 through 3, it's talking about the environment. Days 4 through 6 talk about the inhabitants of that environment, and then they correspond, right? So light and darkness, the sun, moon, and stars. What does it say? They rule over the light and the darkness to separate the light from the darkness, right?
that's what I was gonna say.
Okay.
Pattern, I said,
Yeah.
You have things, and you have the things that
Things that are like the environment and the things that exist in the sort of arena of it, and then the participation in that environment, taking on roles of responsibility, right? The sun, moon, and stars over the light and darkness, humankind over the realm of land and seed, things like that.
Is there any like connection or reference to like the interdependence of those? Like you can't have
Right.
living things without waters or sun.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? Like
Mhm.
there's
Later biblical, not within Genesis, but later biblical things will talk about that, about the idea that things become cataclysmic when when these things gets out of sync, right? And then, again, that's the point. Think of God is forming a great mechanical machine, not in like a cold way, but like this amazing mechanism, this amazing organism that is the universe that operates together, right?
It's just my 5th grade teacher brain.
Yeah.
I'm going, okay, we teach about the geosphere and the biosphere.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's one of those things. So just exactly.
It is presenting it like that. They're not supposed to be separated. They're supposed to be everything is working in relationship to each other. Yeah. Notice how the creation in the 7 creation days, we find the most basic and fundamental necessities for our existence, what we need to be, to exist. Day 1 is light. Day 2 is space. Day 3 is energy. So our consumption of energy that helps us to continue to move. Day 4 is time and measurements of time. Day 5 is boundary markers around where we are to be and where we are to not be. And consciousness on day 6. The emergence of the image of God, and then the purpose, what we were made for, on day 7. Okay?
I was gonna say, with that purpose, because I saw it, like it says rest, and I cannot remember where I read it, but they were talking about some of the original Hebrew words when Jesus took up residence. It's kind of like, it's not just that, oh, he took a break.
Mhm.
Now he begins his reign
Mhm.
over.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
was
Absolutely.
more than just rest, but like he now begins
Yeah.
reign. And then same with us, we're now supposed to be now in doing our purpose.
Absolutely.
That's not,
Yeah, when we get to the end, we'll talk a little bit about the number 7 and what that means in the Sabbath. Yeah. So the creation, just keep this in mind or jot it down or whatever. The creation, just in summary, is an intentional personal action of the Creator. It's the loving work of the only eternally existing being. It's the 6 days of work, the 1 day of rest. And days 1 through 3 is the environment. Days 4 through 6 are the inhabitants. The creation is the universe in its totality, right? And its existence out of non-existence. Creation is the gift of God, right? Which is to be. I just want to talk about, so it says, thus the heavens and the earth were created and all of their host, or all of their multitudes, right? So what are the host? Host means, it's Sava in the Hebrew, and the Hebrew word that translates to host literally means armies, right? So the idea here is that heaven and earth and seas are densely populated with living creatures of all sorts and kinds, all created to glorify the Creator. So we have the host of heaven, the host of celestial heaven, the host of the skies and the waters, the host of the earth and dry land, and then the image of God, right? So we're going to go over these really quickly. Sun, moon, and stars. I want to give you guys some verses and ask you what you think the kinds of beings the sun, moon, and stars are. What are they made for?
Light,
To separate light from darkness, to separate light and sea. Yep. Okay. Psalms 148. Praise him, all his angels. Praise him, all his heavenly hosts. Praise him, sun, moon, and stars. Praise him, all you shining stars. Psalm 8. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place. What is mankind that you are mindful of them? Human beings that you care for them. You made them a little lower than the angels. The heavens praise your wonders, Lord, your faithfulness too, in the assembly of the holy ones. For who in the skies above can compare with the Lord? Who is like the Lord among the heavenly beings? In the council of the holy ones, God is greatly feared. He is more awesome than all who surround him. Isaiah chapter 40. Lift up your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created all these? He who brings out the starry host one by one and calls forth each of them by name. Job 38. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth, when the morning stars sang together and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy? And 1 Corinthians 15. There are heavenly bodies and there are earthly bodies, but the splendor of the heavenly body is of one kind, and the splendor of the earthly bodies is another. The sun has one kind of splendor, the moon another, and the stars another. Each star differs from star in splendor. What kind of, in the biblical conception, what are the sun, moon, and stars?
His glory shows his glory.
They show his glory, yeah. But what are they linked to?
I think it's almost like the Trinity. Like each one has its own different person.
Sure. So,
Because each
Okay, so they're persons.
They're persons, and
You're saying the sun, moon, and stars are persons?
yeah,
Yeah.
well, because
Is that where we're getting at?
we said earlier that each Trinity person like had a part in creating.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So
Yeah.
I think that was like a representative.
I think I'm more like if we're categorizing the types of beings that or creatures that God creates, what are the sun, moon, and stars connected to? Yeah. So Psalm 148, praise him, all his angels, praise him, all his heavenly hosts, praise him, sun, moon, and stars, or sun, moon, and shining stars. And then I'll just do Job 38 again. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth, when the morning stars sang together and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy?
It's not just personification.
Yeah, that's a great question. So is the Bible personifying using personified language, describing metaphorically,
Yeah.
or is it figurative language, or is there a connection between sun, moon, and stars and conscious beings? Is the question, I think. Conscious beings. Remember what they're meant for. They're meant for signs and for seasons, right? What happens when Jesus is born? A star. In Matthew, what happens in Luke? Shepherds are keeping watch of their flocks by night, and the host of heaven, angelic host of heaven, comes and sings a glory song, right? You see what I'm saying here?
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say too. Like, I mean, all throughout the Bible, still people, including Jesus, will name specifically. Like, I could call down legions of angels. These are creatures that somehow exist because they're referenced, right?
Yeah.
The archangel Michael.
And there's a idea of we assume that they exist because maybe we can see their bodies. Is an idea. Okay, so just bear with me. To ancient cultures, the various kinds of lights in the sky represented heavenly sky deities and powers in the unseen realm. Okay, so this goes into the signs and the seasons thing. What happens when the signs in the sky change from one season to the next? When we move from from winter to spring, and the stars have now changed, what happens? Things change on the earth. You follow me? The powers of above now manifest on the earth. Okay? You see what I'm saying? So sky is often synonymous with the heavenlies in the ancient worldviews. The gods were associated with the celestial bodies that lived above the world, moved with the flow of time, and looked down upon humanity. Okay? Ancient Hebrews saw the keeping of time and regulation of the religious festival worship as operating by the authority and direction of those stars. Okay? So in Genesis 1, the heavenly host, sun, moon, and stars, are under the supreme authority of the Creator God. Contrary to pagan conceptions, they are intentionally created by the Most High God and granted authority by Him and exist as signs and powers in heaven for the well-being of humanity. These are living creatures in the biblical worldview, and these figures were originally appointed by God to declare His radiance and keep the calendar of His festival worship. Okay? So we think of stars and planets as rocks and balls of gas in the sky, and that is what they are. But there is a question of they point us towards something, right? They point us, and in the ancient conception, they are somehow causally linked to unseen powers, okay? To unseen authorities.
Morning star. I don't.
Yeah. So Lucifer is said to be, Lucifer means it's the Latin
And the
for morning star.
Is obviously different from.
Yeah, morning star would be the stars that you see as the sun is coming up.
What is it coming up?
Venus, yeah, would be an example. So that to the ancient mind, which represents the god Jupiter? The statue? It would be both. Okay? It would be both. This is why when they see a comet after Caesar dies, they say, Caesar is ascending into heaven. You see what I'm saying? you have to just abandon your sense of things are random and meaningless, the sort of materialist mindset, because they didn't think of things that way, right? So Deuteronomy chapter 4, beware lest you raise your eyes to heaven, and when you see the sun, moon, and the stars, and all the host of heaven, you be drawn away and bow down and serve them, things that the Lord your God has allotted to the peoples, to all peoples under the whole of heaven. So you guys see what I'm getting at here. The idea for ancient people, why do we call it Venus and Jupiter and Saturn? And these are Greek, they're Roman gods. You see what I'm saying? Sorry, Roman gods. It's because they were associated with sky deities, okay? Deities in high heaven, okay? Does that make sense? They were thought to come down at different times. And of course, we have angelic beings show up in the Bible as human entities, right? But yes, there's a connection between the stars. And so just to frame it in a different way, has anyone read C.S. Lewis before? So C.S. Lewis has a series of books called the Space Trilogy, right? And in that series of books, as the main character goes to different planets, he will encounter the angel of that planet. You see what I'm saying? So he will encounter, and the angel will say, I am, and then they will say the name of the planet. I am, Mars is Malacandra in that book. I am Malacandra. You see what I'm saying? So does that make sense? He thought of them almost as the planets themselves are almost like vehicles that the angels drive. Does that make sense? You could say they're bodies that the angels inhabit, right? There's different ways of thinking about it, okay? The main point.
I feel like it's really cool that like things in the physical material world have like a mirror image on the spiritual, like in the spiritual realm. Also, I think it's so cool how that scripture says, "Where were you when I created the world and all of the heavenly beings sang for joy?" And then at Jesus' birth, the angels come and they sing for joy, and it's almost like a recreation, like a new creation, like starting the new kingdom as Jesus comes.
Absolutely.
It's so like that's so symbolic and meaningful. It's so cool.
Is that making sense, guys? Some people really struggle with this concept. It's just true that ancient people thought of stars as gods, right? And in the ancient Hebrew mindset, those gods, those deities, they would be created beings, in our parlance, angels. You see what I'm saying? Does it make sense? You asked the question, is it just figurative language? The only issue with that, I wouldn't necessarily just figurative. It certainly is symbolic in many ways. But I guess I'm just saying that in their construction, in the way that they're thinking about things, they do look up and they see things that move. And they ask the question, why is it moving and what does that mean? Right? The planets move. Sorry? They don't move. They move with the flow of time. Yeah, we do. But again, not through your naked eye. Yeah. And that's how they're thinking about it, is through their naked eye, right? And you do see sort of some stars go out of whack, right? Because you see shooting stars, right? And this is why I'll get into it when we get in Genesis 6. Okay. All right, so the Leviathan, that's another question that we had. I'm going to ask the same question. So let's read from Psalm 104. Here is the sea, great and wide, which teems with creatures innumerable, living things both small and great. There go the ships and Leviathan, which you formed to play in it. So you said Leviathan sounds evil. Does he sound evil? Does Leviathan, Tanin, sound evil here? You formed to swim and play in the seas, right? So again, evil is the mixture, is the mixture of these things. Leviathan belongs in the waters, right? Here's another one. You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the sea monsters on the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. Whoa. Does he sound evil here? Why? You broke the heads, you crushed, you gave him as food for creatures of the wilderness. How do we deal with this verse then in response?
in the sea.
The idea here is the sea monsters. You crush the head of the sea monsters. You crush the heads of the Leviathan. Sorry, where does it? Oh, divided the sea. There's the division there, right? The idea is what happens when water becomes formed into purpose. What is formed? What is like water that is like helpful to you? What would you call that? Calm or controllable? Maybe a river. You see what I'm saying? So the idea of when does a sea become a river, right? That's sort of what is happening here. God creates from the chaos, from the waters, he creates a river, right? Gave them for creatures as food for creatures in the wilderness, right?
Still waters.
Yeah. Are you guys following me there? No? Sorry. Okay. Well, that's good that you said that. Well, no, it's good that you said that. So the idea is Leviathan belongs in Leviathan represents this creature. I think I know where we're getting hung up. Is Leviathan like a physical flesh and blood creature?
Think no.
Why? Why would you say that? Yeah.
Because I don't think. Well, maybe I'm misunderstanding. Oh, this is insult. I'll say because I haven't seen where it says like God sent the devil to earth. Therefore, it would be like a devil spirit.
Okay, so yeah, that is so interesting. So you instinctually are connecting Leviathan as though Leviathan is the devil.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. It's a very, very complicated topic. That's all I can say. So you're thinking of Leviathan as a spirit.
Yeah.
Okay. It's a spirit. Anyone else?
No,
Does it have something to do with like Sheol?
Yes, it does. Yeah. But again, Sheol is the realm of the dead. It's you go back into the chaos, right? Leviathan is a conceptual idea about chaos itself or disorder, right? And so the idea here is that there are creatures in the water, right, that are meant to live there and are meant to dwell there, and it's good that they exist, right? So the Bible, it's trying to bridge that gap between how do we hold to this image of a chaos creature of the waters, right? But also acknowledge that it's awesome that dolphins exist, right? Does that make sense? But when the dolphins come up on the land, what happens to them? They'll die, right?
Kind of like chaos isn't always evil; it needs to be tamed.
It needs to be tamed and put in its proper place. Yes. And its proper place when it's on the land is as food for creatures of the wilderness.
Well, in Hebrew, I'm looking at the Hebrew word for Leviathan. Means twisted or coiled.
Twisted, coiling serpent. Yeah. Yeah.
Twisted and coiled
Yeah.
snake.
Yeah. Serpent. Yeah. So many. That's dragon. Dragon often means serpent. In the they're connected.
So is it a serpent demon?
It's not. The thing is Leviathan is more like a costume. It's a type. It's a pattern. It's like there are times when the satanic figure is called Leviathan, right? You see what I'm saying? But God doesn't create out of nothing evil. You see what I'm saying? I'm glad we're sticking on this, to be honest. We have a bit more to get through, but I'm glad that we're sticking on this. So in Isaiah in a chapter of Isaiah, there's a verse that God says that the most literal translation is I create light and I create darkness. I create evil is a term. I create I bara ra. Okay? Now, we all know that God does not create out of nothing the concept of evil, right? He himself is not evil. He doesn't create. It's a logical fallacy. Remember what I said about barahing, how it's organization into its proper place. Okay? And so what the Leviathan represents is it represents chaos and disorder in its proper place. You see what I'm saying? There are elements of the world that it is good and necessary for the world to keep running, that things do sort of decompose. They sort of break down. A perfect example of that is the food that you eat. Okay? Something grows out of the ground and you take it and you crush it and you destroy it and it turns into your body. You see what I'm saying? That is the idea of Leviathan working in its proper order. Okay?
So Leviathan would be the process of destroying the food.
Of destroying that. It's conceptually connected is the point that I'm trying to make. It's decreation.
Recreating in your body.
Yes. So the point here is Tanin, it's a representative image. Leviathan or dragon, it's a representative image to describe that element of life that you will encounter when things start being destroyed, right? Does that make sense? And
symbolized as either as chaos and evil.
Chaos, yes, evil in the sense of again, evil, moral evil is when creatures who are meant to be good and reflect God's image and are God's image are now acting destructively. You see what I'm saying? So that's evil.
So they're taking on the spirit of Leviathan and acting out what we're not meant to do that.
Exactly. So the best example, we're getting ahead of ourselves, but the best first example of that in the Bible is going to be the story of Cain and Abel. Where the form of man that God made 2 chapters ago is now the blood is spilled out all over the ground, right? And so the sin that is crouching at the door, God says that to Abel. He says, you must master this thing. Instead, it masters him and he kills Abel. So now Cain has reversed what God did. You see what I'm saying? God made Abel. Cain destroyed Abel. You see what I'm saying? So, but again, that destructive force is good in its right place when we break down food as just one example. So the idea of Leviathan, the seas which you formed Leviathan to play in, you see what I'm saying? The idea is there is a proper order. What's wrong is when, as Daniel describes, he's describing these great empires, these great world empires of history, and he describes them as monsters that come out of the sea and onto the land, right? And there's these great, incredible, destructive monsters that come out of the sea and onto the land, right?
When Jesus conquers death, he's mastering Leviathan and putting it back into the sea, basically.
Yeah, I mean, all the way into the point in Revelation when it says there is no more sea, right? So there reaches a state of glorification, of immortality, of eternal life, where that necessary process of breaking down food no longer exists, right? Does that make sense? You have a glorified body. That's sort of where the whole point of the Bible is going to, is where you become ultimately a perfected being, where you and God are so united that you don't need food to exist. You see what I'm saying? Leviathan there's no more sea. Okay? I'm glad that we stuck on that for a few minutes because it's important that we all get that. Okay? Yeah. So again, like here's another example. Leviathan is given as food for creatures of the wilderness. The idea is you can turn this destructive process into something good, which is the food for creatures of the wilderness. The sea turning into a river. So again, in Revelation, in the new creation, it says there's no sea, but there is a river. You see what I'm saying? So
Yeah, there's always
these images.
like in Eden, there's rivers, and in Jerusalem, it talks about the river flowing from Jerusalem.
Absolutely. So just in Job, it says, Leviathan sees everything that is high. He's king over all the sons of pride, right? This idea of, and then here's lastly in Isaiah, this is talking about the day of the Lord. It says, in that day, the Lord with his hard and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent. He will slay the dragon that is in the sea, right? So this idea ultimately of that destructive power has been harnessed on the land in such a way that now the order that God has created has been disordered, and that God will do away with all of it. and he will restore everything to perfection. Again, in Revelation, there was no sea, is the point that John makes, right? Okay. So Leviathan, this is what, again, is a serpentine being. Snakes are associated with water and stuff like that. And so when you have the serpent in the garden, you see what I'm saying? There is a connection there. Okay. So the sea dragon, just as a summary. People living in antiquity understood the sea to be inherently dangerous. In ancient worldviews, the sea is a wild realm without form and void. Ancient people believed the waters beyond the shore were home to all sorts of creatures hostile to the world of land, seed, and humanity. The dragon of the deep dark sea represented chaos, disorder, danger, and death, and was often included in creation narratives. So remember, we read that pagan one, the dragon is there too. In Genesis 1, the Tannin Leviathan is the sea serpent that is regulated outside the realm of humanity. According to the Hebrew mindset, God is not threatened by chaos dragons, unlike an alternative, the gods are threatened by chaos dragons, but God is not, right? Instead, he is one who baras the Tannin into its own place. Okay? Remember what we meant by when we talk about Barak. He baras the Tannin into its own place. He sets the boundaries of that space so that the world of man is supposed to be not at all threatened by the dragon of the chaos waters. However, given the fall of humanity, later texts will draw an essential and important connection between the Leviathan dragon and the Satan figure. Okay? We all good there? We all caught up? Okay. And here's that verse that I threw up there. Okay? Okay, we have a few minutes to talk about the image of God. Sorry, we're going a little bit late again today. Sorry. Okay. So the image of God. The verse reads, then God said, this is verse 26, then God said, let us make man or humankind in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over the cattle and over all the wild animals of the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. So God created humankind in his, or as his, idol. Okay? You said this last week, that we are God's idols. That is true. So Salem is the Hebrew word, a word most often referring to images and idols of pagan gods. In light of this, when used in the Genesis narrative, the word refers to humankind as the idol of the Creator, right? That uniquely represents him and has dominion in God's creation. Take note that this word does not refer to any given attribute or ability unique to us, right? Neither does it have anything to do with physical, anthropomorphic, human-like features. That would be problematic, right? Some people are born without limbs. So have they lost the image? Some people are born or at some point in their life lose their cognitive function. Does that mean that they are no longer the image, right? So the image is not a thing that we have that is like, oh, it's our intellect or it's how we look or things like that. The image is the representation, right? It's a matter of status, role, calling, and rank, right? The nature of humanity is as God's image, no matter what kind of human they are, right? No matter, again, if they have impaired cognitive function, if they have impaired bodily function, you see what I'm saying? And of course, this all culminates in Jesus as the perfect human who is the image, right? So verses on humans, you made humans rulers of the work of your hands. You put everything under their feet, all flocks and herds, all animals of the wild, birds of the sky, the fish in the sea, all that swim in the paths of the seas, right? So the idea here is that humans are made to be the pinnacle of creation, right? They are the ultimate expression of God and his authority on the earth, right? Psalm 139, you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. That's a very interesting language there that we'll skip over. Romans chapter 8, for the creation waits with eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. The creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. Okay, so the idea is that the The image of God is the thing that liberates the creation from Leviathan, right? And the revealing of the sons of God, when that happens, is when, per Isaiah, he will slay the dragon that is in the sea, right?
I don't know if you talked about this yet, but the idea of the image of God also includes this role as co-creator with God and co-bearer with God. So like we were meant to expand the Garden of Eden to.
Yeah, I'm getting into it. Yeah.
Oh, you are.
Yeah. No, you're doing great.
Reading about that. Just remembering that like creation almost hadn't hit its peak form.
Right.
We were meant to bring it to that, but we failed.
Absolutely.
And so it will become that one day.
Yeah, that's great. Since death came through a man, the resurrection of the dead also comes through a man, right? So the idea is that humanity is the focal point, right? And of course, that man is Jesus. And we are members of his body, right? So we are participants in Jesus's work and who he is. We are participants in the image of God. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife. The two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I am saying it refers to Christ and the church. Okay? So the idea is the image of God is male and female, in husband and wife, in Christ and in head and body, Christ and church. You see what I'm saying? Does that make sense, guys? So number one thing, every human person represents God himself. So in our interactions with each other, in your interactions with other human beings, you are interacting with an idol of God. You are interacting with the representative image of your creator, and vice versa. When someone is interacting with you, they are interacting with an image of God, a representative figure that represents who God is, right?
So would that be our intellect, reason, and creativity?
You could say that those are aspects that we benefit, we have the benefit of having those by being images. But again, it's not the image itself, because some people don't have those. Some people, again, they have lack of certain cognition or intelligence, right? But they are still images. You see what I'm saying? It's what God says about them. That's what makes them the image. Does that make sense? So humanity, the image of God, we are a microcosm of a macrocosm. Anyone heard that before? We are a small scale miniature representation of the whole creation. God concludes his creation work by creating beings with all the potential of both angels and animals, right? So angels, they're spirits without bodies. Animals are bodies without necessarily higher spirits. We are animal and spirit, right? Animal and angel, in a sense, who act as rulers of the creation on behalf of the ruler himself, right? Now, remember, we talked a little bit about the Trinity last time. Remember? So God says, let us make mankind in our image, our likeness, this plural language, right? Plural pronouns. And then it says, so God made mankind in his own image, singular pronoun, right? In the image of God, he created him, singular pronoun. Male and female, he created them, plural pronoun. You see what I'm saying? Very interesting. So the image of God, by necessity, is multiple. There's a multiplicity to the image of God that is male and female, in the same way that there is a multiplicity to God himself, Son, Father, Spirit. You see what I'm saying? Male and female, Father, Son, Spirit. There's a multiplicity within the identity of humanity and God. So just talking a little bit about male and female. So biological sex difference is an essential quality of human nature, according to the Bible. Male and female, right? The image of God is dependent upon the plurality, right, of them, right? The fact that they are different is what helps that image be what it's supposed to be, right? The fact of the difference between male and female. It is male and female together that bear God's image as a complex unity, right? So the Trinity is a complex unity. Male and female representing humanity is a complex unity, right?
Husband and wife become one.
Yeah. The duality of male and female is fundamentally important to understanding God's ultimate plan for humanity, as the marriage is a symbol between heaven and earth, Christ and the church. You see what I'm saying? They're said to para, be fruitful or bear fruit, right? Humanity is told by God to be fruitful and become many. God's design and desire for humanity is that they would be an immense plurality of expressions of God, right? That there would be a great amount of these images, a great diversity of these images, right? And that they would flourish in their experience of the good world that God created. They are to cultivate fruit out of the earth, carrying on God's good work by tending to the ground. And they are to bear new life through acts of loving relationship between male and female aspects of God's image. Okay? This is the one slide where we're talking about this in this entire study, so I'll just bring it up just briefly. So the biblical view of sexual activity is that it is the ultimate expression of the duality of humankind as manifest in the physical unity of maleness and femaleness. So again, the Trinity has a multiplicity to it, but they are united as one, right? So what happens when man and woman express the multiplicity and the unity? What happens? They reproduce. New life comes about. New life, okay? Sex is inherently fruit-bearing, according to the Bible. The primary reason for its existence is for humans to be able to bear new life, just as God himself bore creation. So again, image of God, not to make it awkward at all. Image of God, partly in us, is what allows us to cultivate new life, right? You see what I'm saying? That duality, the duality coming into one, manifesting a new being, right? The male body is intrinsically designed for the female body and vice versa. Sexual activity is meant to be enjoyed within the love covenant promise, right? There's no divorce in the Trinity, right? You see what I'm saying? So you guys get at what I'm getting at, or hopefully you understand what I'm getting at here. Humans act out in real time the love process by which new life arises and blooms, okay? So just a small comment. That's why culture war stuff and people getting all like irritated at the Christians for their sexual ethic, they don't understand it's a page one thing. It's a design and what we're meant for type of question. You see what I'm saying? That's what makes it so important. It's not, oh, did Paul say this and did he really mean this? And, it's how did God design, how do our bodies work? That's how, that's just the question. How do our bodies work? That's how God made us, what brings about the process of new life, the act of that process. Does that make sense?
It did. But you know what I was also thinking too is with the disciples, he wanted them to be fruitful and to multiply, to go out and make new.
Yes. So that's a great point. So remember how the fullness of male and female is Christ and the church, right? In that respect, we are all the feminine and Christ is the masculine in that setting, right? And then the end is a marriage between us and heaven and earth and Christ and the church, right? The wedding feast of the Lamb. So that's a great point. New Testament writers will be like, you don't have to get married, right? Because the point here is what, as Paul said, what the man and the woman and all that stuff, what it was pointing towards, which is what we have reached, is what he says, this is a profound mystery, and I'm saying it refers to Christ and the church, you know what I mean? And Paul also is someone who maybe was married at one point, but during the time of the New Testament was not married. And he says things like, yeah, if you all like have the capacity to be, yeah, I wish you were like me and you could just devote your entire lives to, but then he will, it's sort of this looser thing. But the point here is that we're not to stop getting married because we have reached that fulfillment. We can continue to create new image bearers until his coming, right? Does that make sense?
We're called to be fruitful and multiply, no matter what that looks like, whether it's making disciples or.
Yeah, that's another good point, is the be fruitful doesn't have to just be connected to reproduction, right? In the Genesis account.
No, I meant, being fruitful when he's told the disciples to go out, be fruitful,
Hmm.
go out,
Yeah.
and create new
Yeah.
Christian.
Absolutely.
species,
Yeah, no,
which
that's a
is
great
the
point.
same- which is bearing fruit,
Absolutely.
and we're bearing fruit when we go.
That's a
out
great
to
point.
Do that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I was just thinking too. I know one day I was watering the yard and I was looking at the flowers and the trees, and I was just looking at it and it amazed me. And it came to me that everything that God creates, He creates a seed to reproduce.
Mm-hmm.
to give
Yes.
life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. And it gets at what these slides are. So I like that you refrained from saying perfect earlier, right? The Bible does not use the word perfect of the creation. It says good and very good, but it doesn't say perfect, right? So it is an incomplete world, even though God rests. But the point of it being incomplete is so that God passes, in the image, he passes on the role and responsibility of creation. And so it's very important to acknowledge that while the creation order of Genesis 1 is concluded as being very good, the implication is not that the world has come to a state of perfection or total completeness just yet. You don't get that to the last page of the Bible, okay? Something else still needs to take place in order for the world to arrive at God's end goal intention. So we're told to subdue or tread down, right? Tread down. Humankind is called to subdue the earth, right? This is an invitation and permission by God to take control over the natural elements of the world and continue God's work of forging habitable order conducive to thriving and sustainable life for all God's creatures. He passes on that ordering torch and he tells us to name the animals, right? To name the animals, what did God do? Did he name things? And like, it's more than just like, oh, this one's Jerry and this one's Bob, this one's Lion and this one's Fox. It's more than that. To name the animals is to give them their proper place, right? And to rank them and to order them as God has named everything in all creation. You see what I'm saying? So, forging habitable order conducive to thriving and sustainable life. The call to subdue the earth, humanity is given responsibility to tame the yet untamed wilds of the world. Okay? So how do we go into the world and create habitable order as God has created habitable order, right? So be fruitful. Our call as God's imagers, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it. When you have a garden, you have subdued the earth. See what I'm saying? You have to cultivate the ground. You have to make it conducive to life being able to grow in it. You see what I'm saying? You have to give it water. You have to till it, right? You have to break it up. You have to put compost there. You see what I'm saying? So humanity, they are the image. They are the male and female rulers of creation. They're God's representatives for the rest of creation. They're caretakers of the earth and its creatures. They're made to glorify and worship the Creator. They're made to be loved by the Creator. They're called to bear children and subdue a raw and untamed world created as their domain. Okay? The role of humanity as presented in the Bible as a baseline. Obviously, the nature of humanity changes as you introduce the concept of sin in Genesis chapter 3. Okay? Which is, again, just essentially what happens, and this is the major conflict of the Bible, what happens when humans abandon that call and start doing different things.
Mhm.
Does that make sense? When they undo the order that is presented in Genesis 1. Okay? I'll give 2 minutes on the 7 thing. Okay? And then we'll be done. Sorry, we're running late. We spent a lot of time talking on the front end and not actually getting into it. So, we're at the end here. So the meaning of 7. 7 means fullness, completeness, and perfection. Of course, you're never going to find any Bible verse that says, this is what 7 means. But we're observing what it means in a patterned way throughout the Bible, okay? So perfection in biblical numerology does not account for endless work with robotic, perfect efficiency. In God's creation, the idea of the end. The end, right? The time when you cease doing things and you cease working up to something and you start operating within the thing that you've worked up to. Does that make sense? The best example I can give I'll wait to give it. I'll give it in a minute. So just thinking about numbers, because now we're talking a little bit esoterically, but just thinking about how numbers work. Think about what 6 is. 3 plus 3, right? So there's a perfect balancing uniformity, right? 3% and sort of like 1-to-1 equalness, right? So, and that works with efficiency, right? There's 1 for 1, 3 times 3. So a system that works with perfect efficiency makes no room for enjoyment of creation and no room. But if you add 1, that's completion. You see what I'm saying? If you have something left over at the end of that sort of efficient process, now you have room for the thing that process was made for. Okay? So when we get into, again, numerology, it itself is kind of a weird concept. But I'm trying to describe to you how ancient people would think about numbers and how they point us to things. You know what I mean? So 6 sort of represents perfect uniform balance, right? 7 is like, but there's like a point that is bigger than just the endless work. Does that make sense? So this is my visual of it. This is incomplete. You see what I'm saying? It's incomplete. We need something at the end, the thing left over at the end that doesn't have a 1-to-1 match, right? That is actually the point. Are you following me?
It's like what is the literary thing? The
Chiasm. Chiasm. Yeah. It's like chiasm that they have like equal parts on, sort of like
And the chiasm puts
to the thing in the middle. Yeah, which is like the leftover thing because that doesn't have a match. It doesn't that doesn't have a parallel match. Same thing. So 1 and 4, 2 and 5, 3 and 6, that's incomplete. The thing at the end is the point. So that's the numerology of it, right? Anyway, does that make sense? That's just there's so many things you could say about 7 that get really weird and wacky. We don't need to. I'm just trying to give you an idea of that, like the point of the rest is that you work, and then you get somewhere, and that somewhere that you got to, the end, is the point for the work. Okay? You don't just work endlessly. You get somewhere, and that's the point. And that is what the analogy I was going to use is when you clean your house, everyone knows that feeling of sitting down on the couch after cleaning the house. Right? And why is that such a good feeling? You cleaned the house. Yeah, it's a great feeling. You cleaned that house because you want to live in that house. You want to be present in a house that is ordered and pleasant to be in, right?
You don't want
That
perpetually cleaning. You want to enjoy the cleaning.
exactly. That's the point. And that is what is happening on day 7. Okay? God is sitting down on the couch of his house and taking up residence and ruling that. And now he has command over it in such a way that now his presence fills, and now that he's the main deal. He's ordered everything and now he sits, right? And so this is the 7 days, they match 1-to-1 when you read in 1 Kings, the story of the temple dedication ceremony. The temple dedication ceremony, it's a 7-day process. It's a 7-day festival on the 7th month of the year, on the 7th year of building the temple. Okay? In the 11th year, in the month of Bol, which is the 8th month, the house of the temple was finished in all its parts according to all its specifications. It took 7 years to build it. All the Israelites came together to King Solomon at the festival of tabernacles in the month of Ethnaim, the 7th month. The seventh year, the 7th month. You shall keep the festival of tabernacles. So the tabernacle festival is 7 days. On the 8th day, they held a solemn assembly, for they had observed the dedication of the altar 7 days, and the festival was 7 days. So the dedication of God's house in Israel is a 7-day long festival dedication on the 7th month of the 7th year of building it. Okay? So you can see why the Hebrew writer is giving this 7-day motif in Genesis. Right? Cosmic throne temple rest. The 7-day creation narrative clearly mirrors the temple dedication ceremony celebrated by the Israelites after the building of Solomon's temple, God's dwelling in Israel. The point of connection here is that the purpose of the entire creation is to be God's temple dwelling. Make sense, guys? So why the 7 days? It's because of that festival, right? That points to what it means for the 7th day to be the day of rest. So Shabbat, linked to the Hebrew word for 7, shevi. The Hebrew word for rest or cessation implies a settling or fulfilling the point of the work. To Shabbat is to reach a climax, to achieve completion, to enter into a state of wholeness, to arrive at the end goal of work. And shalom is another one of these terms, peace, right? Or harmony. So also tied to the number 7 is the concept of shalom, which is God's ultimate goal for the creation. Shalom is best understood as meaning something like peace, but this peace does not mean inactivity. It means continuous flourishing, harmony, and prosperity, which is the final destiny for heaven and earth. Okay? There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God, for anyone who enters into God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his. So the idea here is that when we enter into God's rest, we enter into the point of our existence, right? Okay. So this was that question, the age of the universe, right? The 7-day creation narrative follows the origin of the Sabbath story from Exodus 16, which we didn't get into today, but we will, and the temple dedication. So whatever your chosen understanding about the age of the universe, is it 13.7 billion years or is it 6,000 years? Understand that Genesis is not a scientific description, right? It's pulling on these different things. And yom itself can mean a multitude of things as the Hebrew word for day. So I'll just leave it at that. I'm not trying to push any particular view. That's the point. You can accept what modern scientists say about the ancient, prehistoric past, or you can accept what, young earth folk say. It's up to you. It doesn't really change the meaning of the text. Okay? A lot of people will get really mad at me for saying that. But it's just true. The text has its priorities, and its priorities are not our priorities. So here are the main points. God is distinct from his creation as he eternally exists in glory and majesty. Being and existence is inherently good. To exist is a gift, right? The universe exists as an intentional act of the creator. It has a destiny. So it's like if you're ever feeling meaningless, just like think about these things, okay? The universe has a destiny. Human beings are the pinnacle of creation as the image of God. Finally, I just want to touch on this. We are not self-made, okay? So connect this back to the whole Bible. It is by grace that you have been saved through faith. It is the gift of God, right? We are his workmanship created in Christ, created for good works. Be fruitful and multiply. You see what I'm saying? So it's the same thing. It's the same God, right? We are passive in the creation. We begin and we're passive in our salvation. You see what I'm saying? God is the one who saves. God is the one who gives grace. You see what I'm saying? It's not our own doing. We don't create the world. God creates the world. He creates humanity. He creates you as a new creation. You are not responsible for that. You see what I'm saying? It's the Spirit hovering over the waters of baptism that changes you into a new person, right? It is by grace you have been saved through faith. It is not your doing. It is the gift of God. But you are created for good works. You are created to do good, but you were not saved by doing good. Okay? You are the Tehom. You are the deep, dark abyss of waters. That's your native state. You need the Spirit of God to order you. Okay? No, commentators have always said Adam's hand is passive. It is God who reaches. Adam is relaxed, and he's a passive participant in the creative act of the Creator. God is not an old man who lives in the sky. I know this is an art depiction, but that's what is to be acknowledged about that painting, is what it's trying to tell you. We are passive people in God's creation, right? In God's creative act, I guess is the point. Once he creates, then we act as his image, right? I just really want to drive that home because a lot of people, they get religious and then they're like, I have to read my Bible and I have to do this and I have to do that. And I got to work my way up toward God, right? We don't build a tower of Babel, right? God incarnates himself, okay? God comes down to us. God reaches down to us. He comes to the waters. He creates out of the waters, okay? That's the gospel in Genesis 1, okay? Any books that I would recommend? Here's just a couple books to check out. Yeah. Oh, yeah. 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 It's scholarly and very confusing. Hopefully, not too much. Guys, I'm sorry that we went late today. I should have started earlier, but I was having fun just sort of chatting. So, yeah. This slide. Yeah, this will be in the. So, how do we feel? Genesis 1. I'm glad I wanted to get to the end because I knew I had a little bit of a gospel message in there. Yeah. So you feel good? Okay. All right. Thank you guys. All right. Go to church.